beneath one of the harshest deserts on Earth, where the wind seems to erase every footprint and every memory, archaeologists began to notice something strange: lines too straight to be natural, stones half buried in sand, and traces of a city no one expected to find. This is not a tale of fantasy or treasure, but of water, trade, survival, and a forgotten world hidden beneath the dunes. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy ancient history, lost civilizations, and mysteries buried by time. The desert does not look like a place that keeps secrets. It looks like a place that destroys them. Wind drags its fingers over the dunes, lifting one skin of sand and laying down another, until every ridge seems newly born and every footprint is erased before it can become memory. At noon, the surface burns pale gold. At dusk, it turns bruised and coppery, as if the land itself remembers fire. Nothing here appears permanent except the emptiness. A traveller standing on the edge of the Great Arabian Sands might see only distance, heat, and the trembling illusion of water where no water exists. Yet beneath that silence, under layers of blown sand and broken stone, there are shapes that do not belong to nature alone. They are too straight, too deliberate. A faint line runs beneath the dunes where no dry river should run. A squared shadow lies below the surface, visible only when the sun lowers and the angle of light makes the land confess. From the ground, it is almost nothing: a slight rise, a scatter of worn fragments, a place where the sand feels harder underfoot. From above, it begins to look different. The desert, seen from the sky, sometimes reveals what it hides from the human eye. Tracks converge. Old paths bend toward a centre. A buried outline appears like the ghost of a wall, and slowly, what seemed like an empty wasteland begins to resemble the last cover thrown over a city. This is where the mystery begins, not with a golden palace gleaming under the sand, not with a lost kingdom waiting intact like a treasure chest, but with something quieter and far more powerful: the possibility that people once built a life where survival itself looks improbable. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story ahead is not only about ruins, it is about water in a waterless country. Wealth carried by animals through lethal heat, memory changing shape across centuries, and the strange way a city can vanish so completely that later generations are left arguing over whether it was ever real. For a long time, desert cities have lived in that uneasy space between evidence and imagination. The mind wants them to be impossible. It wants towers swallowed overnight, gates sealed under dunes, whole streets lying untouched in darkness. Popular stories often polish these places into legends, making them grander, richer, and more mysterious than the archaeology can safely prove. But the real mystery is not smaller because it is more grounded. It is larger. A real city beneath the desert asks a harder question than a fantasy city does. It asks how human beings learn to bend the harshest landscapes just enough to live inside them, trade through them, and sometimes grow powerful because of them. The site at the heart of this story belongs to that world of uncertainty. It has been associated by some researchers and writers with ancient desert traditions, with caravan routes, and with the memory of a place that later storytellers imagined as magnificent and doomed. Scholars still debate how closely the ruins match the legends attached to them, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests that the desert was never simply empty. It was crossed, known, named, feared, and used. The same sands that seemed to separate worlds also connected them. Across them moved incense, cloth, copper, dates, leather, spices, and news. Across them moved people who understood stars, wells, winds, and the moods of camels better than any mapmaker sitting safely in a distant city. To understand why the first traces matter, one has to forget the modern habit of looking at a desert and seeing only absence. The people who travelled these lands did not see absence. They saw danger, yes, but also passage. They saw hidden water, seasonal grazing, stone markers, salt flats, valleys, and routes remembered through generations. A dune field could kill the careless, but it could also protect the skilled. A settlement positioned near a reliable water source could become more than a refuge. It could become a toll gate, a market, a meeting place, a storehouse, and a point of control. In a world where certain goods were worth enormous effort to move, the edge of the desert was not the end of civilization. Sometimes it was where civilization made its profit. The surprising detail is that the first clue to such places is often not a monumental ruin at all. It may be a scatter of pottery so weathered that it looks like ordinary gravel. It may be a low mound that generations of herders have passed without noticing. It may be a cluster of stones too collapsed to declare itself as architecture. In some desert sites, the most important evidence begins as discoloration, a difference in soil texture, or a pattern only visible from aircraft or satellites. Human presence leaves marks that are stubborn in one way and fragile in another. A wall may fall, but the foundation can influence how sand settles. A road may disappear, but centuries of passage can compact the ground. A well may dry out, but the settlement around it can leave a stain in the landscape long after the last bucket is gone. So the desert becomes a kind of damaged manuscript. Most pages are missing, others are scraped, overwritten, and burned by time. But here and there, a line remains legible, a caravan track, a collapsed chamber, a pottery rim, a buried wall. The task is not simply to find the city. It is to read the broken surface without forcing it to say more than it can. No single explanation fully accounts for every story told about the ancient city beneath the sand. The line between archaeology and legend must be walked carefully, because the desert encourages exaggeration. Its silence is so enormous that imagination rushes in to fill it. And yet the stones remain. That is the essential fact. Somewhere beneath the surface, people arranged the world into human shapes. They cut, carried, stacked, repaired, and returned. They built around water. They planned for heat. They stored goods against scarcity. They watched the horizon for caravans. Their city, whatever name it carried in its own time, was not born from fantasy. It was born from practical needs sharpened by an unforgiving environment. Every wall was an argument against the desert. Every well was a fragile victory. Every day of occupation meant that knowledge had triumphed, for a while, over thirst. Then something changed. The surface closed over the evidence. Sand moved where people once moved. Roots shifted. Memory loosened from place and attached itself to story. The city sank first into abandonment, then into rumour, then into the strange half-life of a lost world. Centuries later, when searchers began looking again, the desert gave them almost nothing at first. Just traces, just shadows, just the unsettling suggestion that beneath an empty landscape, a human past was still waiting. Not intact, not easy, but present enough to disturb the silence. Long before the desert becomes a symbol of emptiness, it is a living borderland, and its silence is not yet complete. The land that later appears abandoned is threaded with movement. Water does not spread across it generously, but it appears in the right places at the right moments, in hidden pockets, in seasonal channels, in low basins where rain gathers briefly before sinking away. After rare storms, dry valleys wake like old veins under the skin of the earth. Grasses rise quickly, almost urgently, and animals follow the green as if answering a signal older than memory. For a short time, the desert softens. It does not become kind, exactly, but it becomes negotiable. To people who understand it, such a place is not a blank space on the map. It is a landscape of timings. A route that is deadly in one season may be possible in another. A hollow that seems useless for most of the year may hold dampness below the surface. A rocky ridge may serve as a marker when all other landmarks dissolve into heat. What survives in the record suggests that ancient communities did not simply endure these places by accident. They learned them through repeated journeys. Failed experiments, inherited warnings, and practical observation. They knew where animals could graze, where shade might last a little longer, where stones could be piled to guide travellers, and where a settlement might rise without immediately collapsing under thirst. The city beneath the desert belongs to this older pattern of knowledge, before it becomes lost, before it becomes a rumour, before later generations begin to imagine it as a place swallowed by divine anger or geological catastrophe. It exists within a real environment that is difficult but not impossible. Its foundation is not romance, it is calculation. Somewhere nearby there must be water, or at least access to it. Somewhere around it there must be routes worth controlling. Somewhere beyond it there must be people willing to cross dangerous ground because the reward is greater than the risk. Desert-urban life is always a negotiation with limits, and the first limit is water. In southern Arabia and the deserts beyond, water has many forms of power. It can be a spring, a well, a cistern, a seasonal flood captured behind a wall, or a memory of where to dig when the surface looks hopeless. A single reliable source can transform geography. It can turn a stopping place into a village into a market, and a market into a node in a larger system. The surprising detail is that even a modest source, if positioned well, can matter more than abundance in the wrong location. A small but dependable well beside a major route may shape history more than a richer valley far from movement. In dry lands, power often belongs not to those who have the most water, but to those who control the water others must reach. The surrounding landscape is also shaped by older climatic rhythms. Arabia was not always as dry as it is in the most severe stretches known today. Across deep time, shifts in monsoon patterns, rainfall, and vegetation turned parts of the peninsula greener or drier in cycles. By the historical periods connected with desert trade, many regions were already harsh, but not uniform. There were uplands that caught rain, coastal zones tied to maritime routes, wadis that carried sudden floods, and oases that served as anchors in a wide sea of stone and sand. Scholars still debate the precise environmental conditions around particular buried sites, because local evidence can be patchy, disturbed, or difficult to date. But no serious account can treat the desert as if it were unchanged forever. It breathes across centuries, sometimes slowly, sometimes with sudden violence. Human movement follows that breath. Pastoral groups move with herds, reading vegetation and water the way sailors read wind. Traders move with purpose, calculating distance between wells and the endurance of animals. Settled communities depend on both, because no desert town lives by isolation alone. It needs grain from somewhere, dates from somewhere, animals from somewhere, metals, tools, cloth, salt, and news. Even if a settlement grows around one precious resource or one strategic route, it remains part of a web. The city beneath the sand is not an island of stone. It is a point where many lines briefly meet. Those lines can stretch astonishingly far. Incense from southern Arabia can travel north toward the Levant and Mediterranean worlds. Goods can move toward Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. Ideas move with them, although they leave fewer traces. A merchant arriving at a desert stop may carry not only resin and textiles, but also stories of kings, wars, taxes, shipwrecks, droughts, and new demands in distant markets. A city that appears remote to modern eyes may, in its own time, be alert to events hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. The desert does not prevent connection. It filters connection, making it costly, selective, and therefore valuable. This is where ambition enters the story. People do not build substantial settlements in hard landscapes only because they are forced to. Sometimes they do it because hardship creates opportunity. A dangerous crossing gives value to those who can guide it. A scarce well gives power to those who can guard it. A caravan route gives wealth to those who can tax, supply, shelter, or protect it. The earliest growth of such a city may have been humble a water point, a cluster of storage rooms, a fortified enclosure, a resting place for animals, a few families whose lives are bound to the flow of travellers. But over time, repeated use thickens into permanence. Stone replaces temporary shelter, paths become habitual, authority appears, someone collects, someone manages, someone decides who may drink first when many arrive thirsty. The evidence remains incomplete, and the beginning of the city cannot be reconstructed as a clean sequence. Archaeology rarely grants that kind of kindness. Foundations are reused. Later occupation disturbs earlier traces. Wind and salt gnaw at the surface. Still, the broader pattern is clear enough to give the place a human logic. A city under the desert is not a miracle dropped into emptiness. It is the result of a landscape that once offered just enough, and of people who recognized that just enough could become power. Before silence covers it, there is noise here. Hooves and padded camel feet press into hard ground. Ropes creak. Water skins are lowered into darkness. Fires burn low against cold nights, because deserts that scorch by day can chill the bones after sunset. The smell of animals, smoke, sweat, resin, leather, and dust gathers near the walls. Men and women rise before the worst heat, measure supplies, repair straps, grind grain, count jars, and watch the horizon. Children learn early which plants are useful, which insects sting, which weans mean discomfort, and which clouds might matter. The city is not simply built of stone. It is built of habits repeated until they become culture. And in the distance, beyond the last lamps, the desert waits without hurry. It allows the city to exist, but never promises to protect it. Every wall stands under that condition. Every road depends on memory. Every well depends on renewal. For a time, the balance holds, and the place becomes visible enough to matter. But the same forces that make it valuable are fragile. If water fails, if roots bend elsewhere, if rulers lose control, if the climate tightens, the living borderland can begin to harden into the silence that later travellers mistake for timeless emptiness. The wealth that makes a desert city matter does not glitter at first. It hardens on the bark of a small, stubborn tree. It begins as a wound. Along the dry slopes and limestone hills of southern Arabia, where sea mist sometimes drifts inland and gathers against the mountains, the frankincense tree survives in conditions that seem too poor for abundance. Its trunk twists rather than rises cleanly. Its branches look weathered, almost strained, as if the tree has been arguing with drought for generations. When the bark is cut, pale drops of resin bead slowly on the surface. They are left to dry, then scraped away, sorted, stored, and carried north. A small lump of hardened sap can pass from hand to hand across deserts, ports, temples, palaces, and tombs, gaining value with every stage of the journey. This is one of the strange truths behind ancient trade. Some of the most powerful networks in the old world are built not on necessities alone, but on substances people believe can transform the air around them. Frankincense is not food, it is not water, it does not shoe an animal or roof a house, yet it becomes precious because it burns with fragrance, because smoke rises where people look for contact between the human and the divine, because temples need it, funerals need it, royal ceremonies need it, and wealthy households use it to mark status. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Greece, Rome, and South Asia, aromatic resins are treated as offerings, medicines, perfumes, purifiers, and signs of refinement. Their value comes from distance, desire, and ritual imagination. A city positioned along the path of this trade does not need to produce the resin itself to profit from it. It only needs to sit where movement must pause. Caravans do not cross long deserts in a single heroic sweep. They move from water to water, from shade to shade, from negotiated safety to negotiated safety. Animals must rest. Loads must be checked. Guides must be paid. Goods must be guarded. News must be exchanged. Disputes must be settled before they become bloodshed in a place where losing men, beasts, or water can ruin everyone. A settlement that offers wells, storage, protection, and authority becomes part of the trade, even if no incense tree grows within sight of its walls. The surprising detail is that the incense trade is not simply a line on a map, it is a rhythm of labour. Resin has to be harvested at the right times and graded by quality. The best pieces are pale and clean, lower grades are darker, dustier, or mixed with bark. Sacks have to be sealed against loss and theft. Camels have to be loaded in balanced fashion, because a badly packed animal can suffer over distance and slow the entire caravan. Water skins must be counted with brutal care. A route that looks short in imagination becomes immense when every day requires fodder, discipline, and calculation. Wealth moves slowly, breathing through the bodies of animals and the patience of people. For the buried city, such trade can explain how permanence grows in a place where permanence seems unlikely. If caravans regularly pass, the city gains reasons to expand. Storehouses become necessary. Courtyards fill with animals. Walls protect not only families but goods in transit. Local leaders, whether chiefs, officials, merchants, or some mixture of all three, can draw power from the ability to organize passage. They may control access to water, regulate markets, collect dues, provide escorts, or arrange agreements with groups beyond the walls. What survives in the record suggests that desert settlements often depend on this kind of layered authority. It is not always the authority of a grand empire. Sometimes it is more practical and immediate the power to keep a route functioning. Beyond the city, the wider world helps raise the stakes. In the great temple economies of antiquity, incense is consumed in enormous quantities. Funerary practices also create demand, especially where fragrance, preservation, purification, and ceremony overlap. In Rome, centuries later, writers complain or boast about Eastern luxuries draining wealth from the empire, and while such accounts can exaggerate for moral effect, they still reveal a real fascination with distant aromatic goods. The smoke that curls upward from an altar in one land may have begun as resin cut from a tree in another, carried through a chain of people who never see the final ritual. The desert city becomes one hidden link in that chain. Its people likely live with a double awareness. They know the intimate limits of their environment, the depth of the well, the season of the winds, the danger of a missed caravan, the condition of the animals at dusk. But they are also tied to a world beyond the horizon. A shift in demand in a faraway kingdom can matter. A conflict along a route can matter. A new tax imposed by a ruler can matter. A safer maritime passage can matter. The desert city may appear isolated from a distance. Yet its fate is entangled with decisions made in courts and ports far beyond the dunes. No single explanation fully accounts for how such settlements rose or declined, but trade gives them a pulse that local agriculture alone could not provide. The markets themselves may not have looked like the grand bazaars imagined in later romance. More likely, they are practical, crowded, dusty, and temporary in their intensity. A caravan arrives, and for a few days the city changes. Animals kneel under loads. Men inspect ropes, jars, leather bags, and bales. Women prepare food, mend cloth, manage households, and perhaps take part in local exchange in ways the surviving record rarely preserves clearly. Pottery vessels move in and out of storage. Metal tools are repaired, grain is measured, dates are pressed or packed. Water becomes the first and last concern. Incense, for all its sacred associations, travels through very ordinary hands. This contrast gives the place its human force. The same resin that perfumes temples also leaves dust on the shoulders of the people who carry it. The same goods that impress kings depend on tired animals and anxious calculations at wells. The buried city is not merely a romantic stop on an ancient route. It is a machine of survival built around movement. Its wealth is never secure, because it depends on others continuing to come. If caravans trust the city, it prospers. If they fear it, avoid it or no longer need it, the walls lose meaning quickly. For now, though, the route still breathes. At night, when the heat releases its grip and the stars sharpen overhead, the settlement must seem both small and important. Fires burn behind windbreaks. Resin is stored in dark rooms. Guards listen beyond the walls. Somewhere, water sits unseen below the earth, more valuable than any fragrant cargo. The desert surrounds everything, but the city has found a way to make the desert serve it. Through incense, risk becomes profit. Through profit, a stopping place becomes a center. Through repeated journeys, the name of the place begins to travel farther than the people who live there, carried like smoke into the memory of the ancient world. To build a city where survival is unlikely, people first have to build a relationship with failure. The desert teaches by punishment. A wall placed badly can become a trap for drifting sand. A cistern left uncovered can turn bitter, foul, or useless. A well dug in the wrong place can swallow months of labour and give back nothing but dry stone. A storehouse that seems sufficient in a good year can become a chamber of hunger when caravans arrive late or storms do not come. The city beneath the desert, whatever name its inhabitants used for it, could not have grown by chance alone. It needed patience, correction, and a practical intelligence sharpened by the knowledge that small errors in dry country become large disasters. The first architecture of such a place is not the visible wall, it is the hidden system. Before gates, courtyards, towers, and storage rooms can matter, water must be found, held, protected, and distributed. In desert settlements, this often means wells cut deep through hard ground, channels designed to guide sudden runoff, plastered basins that reduce seepage, and cisterns built to keep water in darkness where evaporation cannot steal it so quickly. The surprising detail is that some ancient water systems in arid lands were not designed for constant flow at all, but for moments of violence. A storm that might destroy an unprepared camp could become a gift if stonework directed the flood into reservoirs. In such places, survival depends not on gentle rain, but on capturing chaos before it vanishes. Around that water, the city begins to take shape. Its plan is not random. Even if later ruins appear confused after collapse and burial, paths must allow animals to enter without tearing apart domestic space. Storage must sit close enough to markets and caravan yards to be useful, but secure enough to protect valuable goods. Homes need shade, thick walls, and small openings that resist heat. Roofs must be repaired after rare rain and harsh wind. Courtyards become working spaces where grain is cleaned, skins are patched, ropes are twisted, and loads are sorted before dawn departures. In a milder land, architecture may reach upward in confidence. Here, it often turns inward, defensive not only against enemies, but against climate. Stone, mud brick, timber, reed, and plaster each carry their own limitations. Good timber may be scarce and valuable. Mud brick can be strong in dry air, yet vulnerable when sudden water comes. Stone lasts longer, but quarrying and carrying it require labour that must be fed and organised. Every material choice reveals a negotiation with the landscape. What survives in the record suggests that desert builders often used what was near at hand with remarkable efficiency, combining local stone foundations with mud brick superstructures, plastered floors, and shaded rooms. Later observers may see only broken outlines, but those outlines once held a carefully balanced world of temperature, movement, storage, and defense. The walls matter too, though not always in the way legends prefer. A desert city wall is not necessarily a sign of constant warfare. Though conflict is never far from trade, it can mark authority, control access, protect goods, keep animals organised, and separate the managed interior from the open land beyond. At a gate, people can be counted, taxed, questioned, welcomed, or refused. Caravans may arrive with wealth, but they also bring strangers, disputes, disease, rumours, and danger. A gate gives the city a mouth. Through it, the desert enters in measured form. Inside, life depends on order. Someone must decide how water is drawn when supplies are low. Someone must maintain the well, clear sand from passages, repair cracked plaster, oversee weights and measures, and settle quarrels before they threaten wider trust. Scholars still debate the exact political structures behind many desert settlements, especially where inscriptions are missing or fragmentary. But the need for coordination is beyond doubt. A place that serves caravans cannot rely only on private households acting separately. It needs shared rules, whether enforced by elders, merchants, local rulers, religious authority, or officials tied to a larger kingdom. The city's true foundation is social before it is architectural. This is easy to underestimate because ruins make ancient life look still. We see stone and imagine silence, but in its living years, the city is full of repetitive maintenance. Sand has to be swept from thresholds. Animal dung must be collected or cleared. Food must be stored away from pests. Leather water bags must be checked for leaks. Harnesses must be repaired before they fail on the road. Watchmen must keep alert through cold nights. Potters, masons, herders, traders, cooks, guards, and children all move through a landscape of chores that rarely enter heroic stories. The buried city survives day after day, not because it is grand, but because people keep doing necessary things before the desert punishes neglect. The human body also adapts its schedule to the place. Work begins early, slows under the hardest heat, and returns when the sun weakens. Shade becomes architecture, currency, and mercy. A narrow lane is not merely a lane, it is a strip of survivable air. A thick wall is not merely a boundary, it is stored coolness. A courtyard is not merely open space, it is a stage where domestic labour adjusts to light and temperature. Food is shaped by storage and movement dates, grain, dried meat, milk products, and whatever can endure travel or scarcity. A city in the desert is a settlement of careful habits. Wastefulness is not just foolish, it is dangerous. Yet this carefulness does not mean the place is poor or joyless. Where caravans gather, variety arrives. Fabrics of different colours, unfamiliar tools, stories from coasts and kingdoms, ornaments, spices, and new styles can enter through the gates. A child growing up there may know the smell of foreign resin before seeing the trees that produce it. A merchant may recognise accents from lands he will never visit. A local craftsperson may shape goods for people who are gone before the next moon changes. The desert narrows life in some ways and widens it in others. It makes the city dependent, but also cosmopolitan in miniature. Still, the strength of such a place is always conditional. Water systems require upkeep. Walls require hands. Trade requires trust. Animals require grazing or fodder. Authority requires acceptance, or at least obedience. If one piece weakens, the others feel it. A well that silts, a reservoir that cracks, a route threatened by raiders, a rival settlement offering safer passage, a political power demanding heavier tribute. A dry cycle lasting too long, none of these alone must destroy a city immediately, but together, over years, they can turn resilience into strain. For a time, the city answers the desert with engineering, discipline, and memory. It stands because people know where to dig, when to travel, how to store, whom to trust, and what must never be left unrepaired. Its existence is not an act of defiance shouted into the wilderness. It is quieter than that. It is a long agreement, renewed each morning, between human need and a landscape that gives very little away for free, and agreements with the desert, however skillfully made, can always be broken. A city does not become a legend at the moment it falls. It becomes a legend slowly, as distance gathers around it. While people still live there, the place is practical, noisy, and imperfect. Its walls crack, its wells need cleaning, its markets smell of animals and dust, its leaders argue over supplies, tolls, and safety. But once the city slips out of ordinary use, once fewer travellers arrive and fewer people remain to correct the stories told about it, memory begins to loosen. The real settlement becomes smaller in the ground and larger in the mind. What was once a difficult place of trade and survival begins to turn into a symbol. The desert helps this transformation. In wetter lands, Abandoned cities may remain visible for centuries, their walls serving as quarries, shelters, landmarks, or warnings. In the desert, visibility is less reliable. Sand drifts against walls, fills rooms, softens edges, and hides foundations. A gate can become a mound, a street can become a shallow depression, a tower can collapse into a slope of rubble that looks almost natural. Wind does not bury everything evenly, and that unevenness makes ruins strangely deceptive. One generation may still see enough stone to remember a settlement. Another may see only a rise in the ground. A third may know only that older people once spoke of something hidden there. As the physical city fades, stories begin to carry what stone no longer shows. Caravans are perfect vessels for such stories. Travellers have time, distance, and danger around them. A tale told beside a night fire after a hard crossing can grow with each retelling, especially when the place being described lies somewhere behind the dunes, difficult to check and easier to imagine. A ruined city near a vanished route becomes a warning about pride, a memory of wealth, a sign of punishment, or proof that the desert can take back anything. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is familiar across many cultures. Abandoned places attract moral meaning. People rarely let ruins remain merely ruined. The city associated with this desert mystery enters that shadowed territory between geography and myth. In later traditions, lost cities of Arabia are sometimes described as places of extraordinary wealth, towers, gardens, or people punished for arrogance. Some versions become entangled with religious memory, tribal genealogy, and poetic exaggeration. A real settlement may stand behind part of the story, but the story does not behave like an excavation report. It preserves emotional truth more easily than architectural detail. It remembers that there was wealth. It remembers that there was danger. It remembers disappearance. But it reshapes causes, scale, and location in ways scholars still debate. One lesser-known detail is that ancient and medieval geographers often inherited information through chains of travellers rather than direct inspection. A place could appear in written tradition because merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, or local informants described it, and each step in that chain could shift the name or location slightly. In desert regions, where routes changed and landmarks could be seasonal or ambiguous, the same name might attach to a region, an oasis, a tribe, a fortress, or a ruined settlement at different times. Later readers, hoping for precision, sometimes found instead a kind of layered map made of memory. The city beneath the desert may not have been lost only under sand. It may also have been lost under names. Names are fragile things in landscapes of movement. A settlement known by one people may be remembered differently by another. A trading stop may acquire a nickname based on a founder, a tribe, a resource, a well, or a dramatic event. When languages change, when scripts shift, when political powers rise and fall, the original name may be translated, shortened, misunderstood, or replaced. Archaeologists often face this problem when trying to connect ruins to texts. The stones may be real. The written place may be real. But proving that they are the same reality can be difficult. No single explanation fully accounts for every tradition attached to a lost desert city, because tradition is not a straight road. It is more like a caravan track after a storm, visible in places and broken in others. Still, legend can preserve clues. It may exaggerate, but it does not always invent from nothing. A story about a city swallowed by sand may reflect the visible burial of ruins. A tale of sudden destruction may preserve a memory of collapse, earthquake, flood, or political violence, though not necessarily in a literal form. A tradition about wealth may point toward trade, taxation, or control of a valuable route. A warning about arrogance may reveal how later communities interpreted abandonment, not how it actually happened. What survives in the record suggests that legends should not be treated as facts, but neither should they be dismissed as empty. They are evidence of memory, and memory has its own archaeology. The city's reputation likely changes depending on who tells the story. To merchants, it may be a lost station, a place where caravans once rested and business was done. To local communities, it may be part of ancestral landscape, connected to wells, grazing lands, and old routes. To religious storytellers, it may become a moral ruin, a reminder that power and luxury cannot outlast judgment. To later explorers, it becomes a challenge, almost an accusation if the stories are true. Where are the stones, if the stones exist? Why did so many fail to find them? The city becomes more than a place. It becomes a test of whether ancient memory can lead modern eyes back to Earth. But the danger lies in wanting the legend too badly. Many lost city stories have been stretched beyond the evidence by people eager for marvels, treasure, or dramatic certainty. The desert is especially vulnerable to this because its emptiness invites projection. A few ruins can be made to carry an empire, a collapsed wall can become a palace, a storage chamber can become a treasure vault. Responsible archaeology has to resist that temptation. It has to let the city be impressive in human terms, not only in mythical ones. A settlement that organised water, trade, labour and survival in a harsh landscape is already extraordinary. It does not need impossible towers to matter. As centuries pass, the real city continues to sleep under the surface while its imagined form wanders widely. The buried walls remain fixed, but the story travels. It moves through manuscripts, oral traditions, travellers' accounts, religious commentary, and speculative maps. Each version leaves something behind and adds something new. By the time modern searchers begin to look seriously, they are not searching for one thing only. They are searching for ruins, yes, but also for the point where earth and memory overlap. That overlap is never clean. A legend may point in the right direction while giving the wrong scale. It may preserve a name while losing the coordinates. It may remember destruction while misunderstanding the cause. The ancient city beneath the desert becomes powerful precisely because it refuses to sit entirely in one category. It is not pure fantasy because stone and trade and water leave traces. It is not simple history because stories have wrapped around it for too long. It stands somewhere between the measurable and the remembered, waiting for a later age to discover that the desert has hidden not only buildings, but centuries of human imagination. The first signs of decline may not have looked like disaster. A city tied to desert roots does not always fall with flames on the horizon or a single night of terror. More often, it begins with absences small enough to explain away. A caravan expected at the end of the dry season arrives late. Another comes with fewer animals and lighter loads. A familiar merchant no longer appears, and someone says he has chosen a safer road. The market still opens. Water is still drawn. Fires still burn at dusk, but the rhythm has changed, and in a place built around rhythm, even a slight hesitation can be felt like a crack beneath the floor. Trade routes are living things. They are not carved permanently into the earth simply because people have used them for generations. They respond to danger, taxes, political alliances, wells, storms, profit, and rumour. If a well fails on one road, traffic bends. If a ruler begins charging too heavily at one station, merchants look for alternatives. If raiders become active in one region, caravans may detour even at great cost. If a port grows richer and ships can carry goods more efficiently, the long inland road may lose part of its purpose. What survives in the record suggests that desert trade was never as fixed as the lines drawn on modern maps. It pulsed, shifted, narrowed, and widened according to pressures both local and distant. For the city beneath the desert, this is a dangerous truth. Its strength has always depended on being necessary. If caravans need its water, storage, protection, and authority, it can survive in a harsh place. If they no longer need it as often, the same harshness becomes harder to justify. A city in a fertile valley can endure a decline in trade by leaning more heavily on fields, orchards, and local production. A desert city has fewer cushions. Its economy is thinner, more exposed. The walls may still stand, but walls do not feed people. Storehouses may still exist, But without movement, they become reminders of a larger world that is slowly turning away. Water, too, may begin to betray the city gradually. The image of an oasis drying overnight is dramatic, but many water crises are slower and more humiliating. Wells can silt up. The water table can drop beyond easy reach. Channels can break and remain unrepaired because labour is scarce or authority is weaker. Cistern plaster can crack, allowing precious reserves to seep into the ground. Floods, when they come, may damage the very systems meant to capture them. Droughts may last long enough that temporary hardship becomes a new condition. Scholars still debate the precise environmental pressures that affected individual desert settlements, because the evidence remains incomplete and local climate histories are difficult to reconstruct. But no serious explanation can ignore the fragile dependence on water. The surprising detail is that water systems can decline even when water has not completely vanished. A city does not need to be bone dry to become unlivable or unprofitable. It may simply become less reliable. If caravans cannot trust a well at the expected season, they may avoid it. If animals arrive thirsty and the supply is uncertain, conflict can follow. If local households must compete with travellers for limited water, hospitality becomes strain. The same well that once made the city powerful can turn into a source of tension. In dry country, reliability is wealth, and uncertainty is a kind of poverty. Political change adds another layer. Desert routes often depend on agreements among settled authorities, mobile groups, merchants, and larger kingdoms. These agreements can be formal or informal, written or remembered, enforced by soldiers or by reputation. When strong powers protect trade, routes become more predictable. When authority fragments, every stage of travel becomes more dangerous. A city that once stood under the protection of a stable regional system may find itself exposed when that system weakens. Guards become fewer. Payments become more contested. Old alliances fail. Local leaders may demand more from caravans to compensate for declining revenue, which only encourages merchants to go elsewhere. No single explanation fully accounts for the fading of such places, but political instability often acts like wind on an already loosened wall. The wider world also changes. Demand for incense and aromatics remains important for a long time, but the paths by which such goods move can shift. Maritime trade expands in many periods, linking southern Arabia, the Red Sea, the Gulf, East Africa, India, and the Mediterranean in ways that may reduce dependence on some inland routes. Ships are dangerous too, but they can carry heavy cargo in quantities that caravans cannot match. A desert station that once thrived because land passage was essential may suffer when merchants discover, negotiate, or secure alternatives. The city does not need to be abandoned because people stop wanting incense. It may decline because people find another way to move it. Inside the city, these changes are experienced as household realities. Fewer caravans mean fewer customers for food, fodder, repairs, guides, and storage. Fewer customers mean less income to maintain wells, walls, and public spaces. Young people may leave for better watered towns, coastal settlements, or more active routes. Skilled workers may follow demand. Families that remain may reuse abandoned rooms, strip stones from neglected buildings, and shrink their lives into a smaller inhabited core. Archaeologists sometimes find evidence of contraction in ancient settlements, reused walls, blocked doorways, changes in pottery, poorer repairs, or domestic activity inside spaces once used for public or commercial purposes. Such evidence must be interpreted carefully, but it can suggest a city folding inward before it disappears. There may be no single moment when everyone understands that the age of the city is ending. Decline can disguise itself as a difficult season, then another, then a new normal. The market that once filled with voices becomes quiet except on rare days. A courtyard built for many animals holds only a few. Storehouses are emptied and not refilled. A gate that once controlled traffic becomes less important than the task of keeping sand from piling against it. Those who remain may not think of themselves as living in a lost city. They are simply living where their parents lived, repairing what can be repaired, abandoning what cannot, and hoping the old roots will breathe again. But deserts are not sentimental. They do not preserve a city because people once needed it. As movement declines, maintenance declines with it. A roof left unrepaired collapses in a storm. A wall exposed by neglect begins to crumble. A cistern fills with wind-blown sand. Paths once hardened by footsteps loosen. The boundary between built space and open desert begins to blur. The city that had made the desert serve it now loses the daily struggle that kept the desert at bay. From a distance, nothing spectacular has to happen. No empire needs to arrive with torches. No divine fire needs to fall. The tragedy can be quieter and more believable. The roots bend. The water weakens. The politics fracture. The economy thins. And the people leave in stages. What remains is a settlement no longer necessary to the world that created it. And once necessity is gone, the sand has time to do what it has always done best, cover the evidence patiently, grain by grain. Until a city becomes a rumor again. When a desert city begins to fail beneath the surface, collapse can arrive without announcing itself as collapse. It may begin below the feet, in the hidden places where the life of the settlement has always depended on things unseen. A well wall loosens, a channel clogs, a cistern roof weakens. The ground around an underground chamber shifts after rare rain, and a small crack opens in plaster that no one has enough time, labour, or money to repair properly. For years. The damage may be manageable. People patch, brace, dig, clear, and continue. But a city built around hidden water and fragile storage has a private anatomy. And when that anatomy breaks, the visible streets may remain standing for a while, even as the city's real strength is already gone. The desert is often imagined as dry and still, but it can be violently unstable. Wind is patient. Flood is sudden. In arid regions, long periods of drought can be interrupted by intense storms that send water rushing through dry channels with astonishing force. A wadi that looks like a road for most of the year can become a moving wall of mud, stones, branches, and brown water in a matter of minutes. If a settlement has built near such a drainage line because it needs access to runoff, grazing, or a natural route, it also lives near danger. The same landscape feature that helps sustain life can destroy walls, undermine foundations, and fill rooms with debris. Scholars still debate the role that sudden flood events may have played in the decline of particular desert sites, but the danger itself is not hypothetical. Drylands remember water in destructive ways. A failing water system creates more than thirst. It changes the physical behaviour of the city. If channels are no longer cleared, sand gathers in them. If cisterns are abandoned, their covers collapse and become pits that catch more debris. If wells are not maintained, their mouths may break, their shafts may choke with fallen stone, and their surrounding platforms may become unsafe. People begin avoiding certain areas. Streets that once connected the settlement efficiently become blocked or less used. Rooms near damaged structures are abandoned first. Animals are kept elsewhere. Storage shifts into whatever buildings remain dry and defensible. The city does not simply empty. It rearranges itself around weakness. What survives in the record often appears as destruction, but destruction can be deceptive. A collapsed roof might result from abandonment rather than the event that caused abandonment. A layer of wind-blown sand inside a room may tell us the building stood open after people left. Not why they left. Broken pottery may mark daily use, later disturbance, or a sudden episode of damage. The evidence remains incomplete. And archaeologists have to be cautious about turning every fallen wall into a catastrophe. Yet the pattern of collapse still matters. When architecture fails in clusters, when water installations are blocked, when occupation levels shrink, when sand enters spaces that once required constant cleaning, the city begins to show a transition from lived environment to exposed ruin. There is a lesser-known kind of disaster that belongs especially to abandoned desert settlements, the loss of maintenance as a destructive force in itself. A strong building is not strong forever. Its strength is a partnership between materials and people. Mud brick needs replastering, stone walls need resetting, roof beams need replacement, Drains need clearing before storms. Once a population declines, the labour that once held the built world together disappears, even without an enemy. Without earthquake, without dramatic fire, the city becomes vulnerable. It is not that the desert suddenly becomes more powerful, it is that fewer hands remain to resist it. If a major failure did occur, it may have been remembered later as something more sudden and absolute than it really was. A flood that damages part of a town can become, in tradition, the flood that swallowed the city. The collapse of a gatehouse can become the fall of the city's walls. The drying or blocking of a well can become a curse of thirst. Human memory compresses slow decline into memorable scenes. That does not make the memory worthless. But it means the earth must be read separately from the story. No single explanation fully accounts for every layer of abandonment, collapse, and later legend. Because these processes can overlap. A weakened city may be struck by a flood. A damaged water system may accelerate migration. A shrinking population may leave structures unrepaired, making later burial easier. Causes pile up like sand against a wall. Beneath the surface, another process is at work. As buildings collapse, they create their own burial. Roofs fall inward, upper walls slump into rooms, wind carries sand into the new hollows. Broken plaster, ash, pottery fragments, animal dung, and domestic debris mix with natural sediment. A once open courtyard becomes a shallow basin. A lane becomes a trough that guides drifting sand. A room with standing wall stubs traps deposits more effectively than open ground. In this way, architecture helps bury itself. The city becomes a landscape of small traps, each one collecting the desert grain by grain. The first generations after abandonment may still recognize the place. Travelers might shelter against a surviving wall. Herders might use a ruined enclosure to pen animals. People from nearby regions might quarry stones or dig into old rooms looking for usable material. Such reuse can disturb the archaeological record, but it also shows that abandonment is rarely a clean ending. The dead city may have an afterlife of scavenging, shelter, memory, and fear. Children may be warned away from unstable shafts. Travelers may speak of ghosts, danger, or treasure. A ruined well might still be visited until it becomes unsafe or dry. The city is no longer urban, but it has not yet fully disappeared. Then comes the longer burial. Wind smooths the violence. Sharp corners soften. Fallen stones settle into dunes. Sand covers thresholds first, then floors, then lower walls. The outlines remain for those who know how to see them, but ordinary travellers begin to pass without stopping. The desert does not need to erase everything. It only needs to make the remains ambiguous. A mound can be natural or human. A line of stones can be a wall or a chance scatter. A depression can be a room or a hollow carved by wind. Once certainty disappears from the surface, the city enters the deeper phase of being lost. And yet the loss is incomplete. That is why the story continues. The collapse beneath the surface destroys the city as a living place, but it also seals parts of it away. Sand can crush and conceal, but it can also protect from later construction, farming, and reuse. A broken jar left in a buried room may survive precisely because no one sees it for centuries. A wall foundation may remain where upper stories vanish. A water installation, once clogged and useless, may become one of the strongest clues to why people chose the site in the first place. The desert is both enemy and archivist, careless and strangely faithful. By the time the city finally vanishes from everyday geography, its fate has already passed through several deaths. It dies economically when the roots fade. It dies socially when people leave or shrink into smaller lives. It dies physically when water systems fail and buildings collapse. It dies visually when sand makes the ruins uncertain. But underneath, the city has not entirely died. It has changed form. It has become evidence waiting for the right tools, the right questions, and the right kind of patience. Above it, the desert looks empty again, as if nothing unusual has happened. Below it, the broken arrangement of human survival remains, quiet as a held breath. For centuries after the city slips beneath the surface, certainty belongs mostly to people who are wrong. That is one of the quiet ironies of lost places. The less the ground reveals, the more confidently maps, stories, and learned arguments may begin to speak. A scholar in a distant library can draw a name into the desert and believe the matter settled. A traveller can hear a local tradition, misunderstand the direction, and carry that misunderstanding across borders. A mapmaker can copy an older map, then another can copy his copy, and soon an error wears the authority of age. The buried city remains where it has always been, but the idea of the city wanders far away. Desert geography encourages this wandering. Distances are difficult to judge when routes bend around water rather than marching straight across empty space. A journey measured in days may change according to season, animal strength, political danger, or the availability of wells. Landmarks that matter deeply to local travellers may look insignificant to outsiders. A ridge, a dry valley, a stand of trees, a salt flat, a dark volcanic field. A ruin half covered in sand each can guide those who know the region, yet confuse those who only hear about it later. What survives in written accounts often preserves direction and memory, but not the kind of exact coordinates modern readers expect. The evidence remains incomplete, and between those gaps, misplaced certainty grows easily. Later explorers enter this world with expectations shaped by texts, legends, and desire. Some are careful observers, others are treasure seekers, imperial agents, adventurers, or men eager to attach their names to a famous discovery. They cross difficult country with guides, animals, instruments, notebooks, and assumptions. They ask about old cities, lost wells, ruined walls, strange mounds, and names remembered by local communities. Sometimes they are led to genuine ancient remains. Sometimes they are led to places that fit only part of the story. Sometimes they pass near what they are looking for without recognizing it, because the ruin is too small, too buried, too ordinary, or too different from the legend they carry in their minds. This is a lesser-known problem in the search for lost cities. The legend can make the real site harder to see. If a tradition describes a city of shining towers, a field of low walls may seem disappointing. If stories speak of extraordinary destruction, ordinary abandonment layers may appear insufficient. If the expected city is imagined as vast, a compact trading settlement may be dismissed. Yet archaeology often reveals that historically important places do not always match later grandeur. A city can be influential because of its position, not its size. It can be remembered because it controlled movement, not because it covered a huge area. It can become legendary because of what passed through it, not because it resembled an imperial capital. The name itself may mislead. Across centuries, place names shift across landscapes like shadows. A name attached to a people may later attach to a region. A name attached to a route may later be treated as a city. A name preserved in a religious or literary tradition may carry symbolic weight that obscures its original geography. Scholars still debate many such identifications, because a match between a ruin and a name requires more than resemblance. It requires evidence inscriptions, datable materials, geographic consistency, cultural context, and a pattern that makes historical sense. Without that, certainty can become another form of storytelling. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, many searches for ancient places unfolded under the influence of expanding empires and new scholarly institutions. European travellers, military surveyors, and antiquarians moved through regions whose histories were already known to local peoples in forms that did not always fit Western academic categories. Some outsiders treated local knowledge as rumour unless it supported their own expectations. Others depended entirely on local guides while later presenting the discovery as if it emerged from solitary genius. The city beneath the desert, like many ancient sites, became part of this unequal history of looking foreign instruments, measuring landscapes already inhabited by memory. Local knowledge, however, often preserves patterns that formal maps miss. A well name, a seasonal route, a warning about unstable ground, or a story about old walls can carry practical information across generations. That knowledge may not speak in archaeological language. It may not separate Bronze Age from Iron Age, or trade station from fortress, or legend from ruin in the way scholars prefer, but it can point toward landscapes where human traces survive. What survives in the records suggests that the most successful searches often combine outside methods with local familiarity, even when later accounts fail to give that partnership its proper weight. Still, many searchers went astray. Some placed the ancient city too far north, following textual hints that seemed convincing until compared with environmental realities. Others looked too close to known caravan roads and missed the possibility that old routes had shifted. Some assumed that a famous lost place must have left remains visible from a distance, when in fact desert burial can reduce masonry to low, ambiguous forms. Others confused separate ruins, merging multiple ancient sites into one legendary identity. No single explanation fully accounts for the long failure to locate such places, because the failure itself had many causes: difficult terrain, uncertain names, limited technology, political restrictions, wishful thinking, and the patient camouflage of sand. There is also the problem of time. A city abandoned for centuries does not remain fixed in a clean archaeological pose. It is visited, reused, damaged, robbed, buried, uncovered, and buried again. A ruin seen by one traveller may be more visible than it is a century later. A wall exposed after a storm may vanish under dunes before another expedition arrives. Pottery scatters can be moved by animals, erosion, or later visitors, even when descriptions are honest. They may record a temporary surface condition rather than a stable reality. The desert is not a museum case. It is an active landscape, rearranging evidence while people argue over what the evidence means. For the buried city, centuries of misplaced certainty create a double disappearance. First, the city disappears physically beneath sand and collapse. Then it disappears intellectually beneath wrong locations, inflated expectations, and inherited assumptions. The real place becomes almost less important than the imagined one, because the imagined one is easier to discuss. It can be placed on speculative maps, woven into dramatic histories, and used as proof for theories that may not survive contact with the ground. Meanwhile, the actual ruins remain quiet, offering no correction until someone learns to look in a different way. That change does not come from a single heroic intuition. It comes from a broader transformation in how landscapes are studied. Exploration begins to shift from chasing legends on foot to reading patterns across whole regions. Archaeologists, geographers, and remote sensing specialists start to ask not only where the city might be, but what kind of landscape could support it. Where would water have been available? Where would caravans have paused? Which routes connect production zones to markets? Which mounds, tracks, and buried lines look human when seen at larger scale? The question becomes less romantic and more powerful. Not simply, where is the lost city? But what system would have made such a city possible? The desert, which had defeated so many confident searchers from the ground, begins to change when viewed from above. Old assumptions do not vanish immediately, but they weaken. The blank spaces on maps become textured. Faint tracks appear. Drainage patterns become clearer. Low ruins can be connected to roots rather than judged in isolation. For the first time, the buried city has a chance to be found not as a miracle, but as part of a network. The search begins to move away from legend alone and toward landscape logic, and once that happens, the desert's greatest advantage, its scale, starts to become a clue. From the ground, the desert is too large for the eye. It overwhelms judgment by giving everything the same color, the same glare, the same long distances that seem to move as one walks. A low wall can disappear behind a ripple of sand. A buried road can be mistaken for a natural hardpan. A mound can look meaningless until it is seen beside another mound, and another beyond it, arranged in a pattern that no single traveller could easily hold in mind. for centuries. Searchers had tried to solve the city by crossing the landscape step by step, asking where the old stories pointed, following tracks, wells, and rumours. But the desert had an advantage over them. It was not hiding one clue. It was spreading the clues too widely for ordinary sight. Seen from above, that begins to change. The first aerial views do not magically reveal a lost city in perfect outline, but they alter the scale of attention. A pilot, surveyor, or photographer looking down can notice relationships that vanish at walking height. Lines cross the ground where no modern road belongs. Darker patches mark areas where stone, soil, or buried architecture affect the surface. Dry channels curve toward old settlement zones. Slight rectangular forms, almost invisible from the ground, begin to resemble enclosures, walls, or building foundations. The desert does not become transparent, but it becomes legible in a different language. Aerial photography had already transformed archaeology in other parts of the world, especially where crop marks, soil marks, and shadow marks revealed hidden structures. In the desert, the clues are different but no less important. There may be no crops to change colour above buried walls, but there are shadows at low sun angles, differences in sand accumulation, stone alignments, and the pale scars of old tracks. The surprising detail is that some ancient routes can remain visible from the air long after they have disappeared to travellers on the ground. Repeated passage compact soil, clears stones, or creates faint corridors that interact differently with wind and moisture. A road can die as a route and survive as a texture. Satellite imagery expands this transformation even further. Instead of relying only on what one expedition can physically cross, researchers can examine enormous landscapes, compare patterns, and return to promising places with sharper questions. Ancient caravan routes, possible water sources, settlement clusters, and geological formations can be studied together. A buried city no longer has to be sought as an isolated object. It can be searched for as part of a system, a point where tracks converge, where water is plausible, where terrain allows movement, where trade goods might have passed, and where ruins, however faint, fit the logic of human use. What survives in the record suggests that this wider view has been essential in rethinking many desert landscapes once treated as empty. Remote sensing adds still more layers. Different instruments can capture information beyond ordinary visible light, revealing variations in surface temperature, moisture, mineral composition, elevation, and texture. Radar, in some conditions, can detect features beneath dry sand or at least help distinguish buried forms in old surfaces. Multispectral and infrared imagery can highlight differences invisible to the human eye. None of this works like a fantasy device that simply peels away the desert and displays a city underneath. The evidence remains incomplete, and each signal must be checked carefully. Natural features can imitate human ones. Recent tracks can cross ancient ones. Wind can create shapes that look deliberate until tested on the ground. But the tools allow archaeologists to ask better questions before they begin to dig. This is an important change in the story because it shifts the mood of discovery away from chance alone. The city beneath the desert is not found simply because someone stumbles across a stone in the sand. It emerges through pattern recognition. A faint route seen from above becomes meaningful when it connects known regions of trade. A suspected enclosure matters more when it lies near a plausible water source. A mound becomes more interesting when pottery, topography, and old paths support the possibility of occupation. Discovery becomes cumulative. Each clue is weak by itself, but together they begin to pull the invisible city toward the surface. Even then, there is tension. The human mind is very good at seeing patterns, sometimes too good. Once searchers expect a lost city, every line may look like a wall, every depression like a street, every mound like a tower. Scholars still debate particular identifications because remote imagery can suggest possibilities without proving them. A satellite image can point to a place, but it cannot tell by itself who lived there, what they called it, how long it was occupied, or whether it matches a famous tradition. The sky can guide the search, but the ground must still answer. When researchers finally return to the desert with these aerial clues in mind, the landscape looks different. What once seemed like scattered fragments begins to organize itself. A slight rise is no longer just a rise. It may be part of a buried perimeter. A stone scatter is no longer just debris. It may mark collapsed architecture. The surrounding tracks, instead of appearing random, can be read as evidence of movement toward and away from a center. The city is still hidden, but it has begun to re-enter the world as a set of relationships. There is something almost poetic about this. The city was made possible by people who understood routes across the desert, and it is rediscovered by people learning to see routes again, this time from the air. The ancient caravan master and the modern image analyst are separated by centuries, tools, and purpose, but both depend on reading the land at a scale larger than a single footprint. Both know that survival in the desert depends on pattern. The old travelers watch stars, ridges, wind, and wells. The modern searchers watch pixels, shadows, spectral signatures, and topographic lines. In both cases, the empty land is not truly empty. Still, the moment of recognition is not the end. It is the beginning of a more difficult test. A shape in an image must become a trench in the ground. A suspected road must become datable evidence. A possible wall must reveal construction, use, abandonment, and relation to wider trade. The city must be separated from the legend without losing the reason anyone searched for it in the first place. That is the delicate work ahead to descend from the clean distance of the sky into the dust. Where stones are broken, layers are confused, and certainty has to be earned slowly. The desert has offered its first concession. From above, it has shown that the surface is not random. There are old lines beneath the newer ones, human arrangements under the wind's disguise, and traces of a vanished order still pressed into the land. The city no one expected to find is no longer only a story. It has become a target, a pattern, a suspicion strong enough to justify digging. And once the first tools enter the sand, the mystery changes again. Because the desert that hid the city for so long must finally give up something solid. The first cut into a buried city is rarely dramatic in the way imagination wants it to be. There is no sudden doorway opening into a perfect avenue, no complete chamber waiting with its objects arranged like offerings to the future. Excavation begins with dust, heat, measurement, and restraint. The surface is cleared slowly. Stones that once looked random are mapped before they are moved. Soil changes are noted with care. A darker patch, a harder crust, a line of compacted sediment, a scatter of pottery fragments, each may matter, but none can be trusted too quickly. The desert has hidden the city for centuries, and it does not surrender its meaning all at once. The archaeologists who enter such a place must resist the oldest temptation in lost city stories, the desire to confirm the legend before understanding the site. A buried wall is first a buried wall, not proof of a famous name. A storage room is first a storage room, not a royal treasury. A collapsed building is first a collapsed building, not necessarily evidence of a single great catastrophe. The work begins by giving the ruins back their ordinary reality. Where is the wall line? How was it built? What came before it? What was repaired? What was abandoned? What objects belonged to the final occupation? And what fell in later? The evidence remains incomplete. But careful excavation can at least prevent the mystery from being buried under wishful thinking again. As the sand is removed, the city starts to appear in fragments of function rather than grandeur. A foundation emerges, then a corner, then the edge of a room. A line of stones suggests a wall thick enough to carry weight or defend an enclosure. Nearby, pottery sherds lie mixed with sediment, their broken curves more valuable than they look. A rim can help identify a vessel type. A fabric of clay can suggest local production or exchange. A burn mark can point toward cooking, craft, destruction, or later use, depending on its context. Small finds are often more honest than impressive architecture. They speak of daily life, and daily life is where the truth of a city usually survives. One surprising detail is how much ancient trade can be reconstructed from things people threw away, broke, or lost. A merchant may have guarded valuable incense carefully, but the jar that held food for a journey might break and remain in the soil. A bead may slip from clothing. A tool may be discarded after snapping. Animal bones may accumulate where meals were prepared or where caravan beasts were butchered, fed, or left after death. Charcoal from a hearth may preserve traces useful for dating. Seeds, if they survive, can hint at diet, agriculture, imported food, or local vegetation. The great story of a desert city often returns to humble debris, because humble debris is less likely to lie. The excavation also reveals the violence of abandonment in slow physical terms. Rooms may be filled not by one event, but by layers occupation debris, collapse, wind-blown sand, later disturbance, more sand, more rubble. A floor surface might appear as a compacted plain where people once walked, worked, slept, and stored goods. Above it, fallen plaster or stones may show when the building began to fail. Higher still, loose sand may show that the room stood open long after use ended. The sequence matters. Without it, a ruin is only a pile of material. With it, the city gains time again. Walls begin to show habits of construction. Some may be built quickly, with local stone set in practical courses. Others may show repair, thickening, blocked doorways, or changes in use. A doorway closed with a rough masonry may suggest a shrinking household, a defensive adjustment, or the conversion of one space into another. A courtyard filled with debris may show that an area once central to movement became marginal. Storage rooms may indicate planning for trade, scarcity, or both. Scholars still debate how to interpret many such features, especially when inscriptions or clear dating evidence are limited. But the physical city itself starts to push back against fantasy. It was organized, it was used, it changed. Water installations, when found, become especially powerful. A well, cistern, channel, basin, or plastered storage feature can explain why anyone stayed here in the first place. These features often carry marks of repeated maintenance repairs to lining, sediment buildup, collapsed sections, or attempts to keep water clean and usable. A cistern filled with sand may look dead, but in archaeological terms it can be one of the most important structures at the site. It points toward the hidden foundation of urban life. It also reminds us that the city's most precious architecture may have been partly underground, known less by height than by depth. The human presence grows clearer through accumulation. No single object announces the full story, but together they create pressure. Pottery of different types suggests storage, cooking, serving, transport, and exchange. Imported fragments, if present, point toward wider contacts. Local wares suggest everyday domestic life. Grinding stones hint at food preparation. Animal remains may reveal herding, caravan support, diet, and environmental conditions. Burned areas can mark hearths or craft activity. A line of post holes may indicate roofing or temporary structures. Each discovery is modest, but the city returns through modesty. The past rarely rises as a complete vision. It arrives as evidence. There is also disappointment, and that disappointment is useful. Excavation may fail to find the palace imagined by legend. It may reveal no golden treasure, no dramatic inscription naming the city beyond doubt, no perfectly preserved street of wonders. This does not weaken the importance of the site. It clarifies it. The ancient city beneath the desert was not waiting to fulfill a fantasy. It was waiting to be understood as a human place. Its value lies in the way it ties trade to water, survival to planning, memory to landscape, and collapse to the slow failure of systems that once worked. The archaeologist must also deal with disturbance caused by centuries after abandonment. Later visitors may have dug into rooms, reused stones, disturbed graves if graves were present nearby, or left their own traces across older layers. Animals may have burrowed through deposits. Wind may have sorted materials in ways that mimic intentional placement. Modern searchers, before formal excavation, may have moved objects without recording their context. The desert preserves, but not perfectly. It is an archivist with torn pages and missing labels. What survives in the record suggests a real settlement shaped by trade and environment, but every claim must pass through the filter of disturbance. As trenches widen and plans are drawn, the site stops being only a mystery and becomes a map of decisions. Here people built thick walls, here they stored goods, here water was managed, here rooms were repaired, reused, or abandoned. Here the city may have opened toward routes crossing the desert. Here sand entered after the last regular sweeping stopped. The discovery is not a single moment of revelation. It is a slow change in status. The place moves from rumour to site, from site to sequence, from sequence to history. And still, even with walls exposed to the sun again, the city keeps part of its silence. The people who lived there left no complete explanation of their intentions. Their names may be lost. Their voices do not return with the pottery. Their fears, ambitions, rivalries, and private griefs survive only indirectly, pressed into architecture and debris. Excavation brings the city back into view, but not fully back to life. It gives us enough to know that the desert was inhabited with skill, that trade made hardship profitable, and that the buried place was real in stone and labour. It does not give us everything. The sand has opened, but the deepest questions remain just below the surface. What the ruins actually show is both less extravagant and more revealing than the legend. Once the first excitement of discovery settles, the exposed city becomes a collection of stubborn facts. There are walls, but they do not speak in the language of fantasy. There are rooms, but they do not arrange themselves into a perfect tale of kings and sudden doom. There are pottery fragments, traces of occupation, construction choices, possible storage areas, and the unmistakable logic of a place built to manage movement through difficulty. The site does not need to be inflated to matter. Its importance lies in the way ordinary evidence begins to answer an extraordinary question. How could a city exist here at all? The first answer is organization. Even in fragmentary form, the ruins suggest planning, or at least repeated adaptation around practical needs. This is not simply a scatter of temporary shelters left by passing travellers. A true desert stop can begin with tents and animal enclosures, but a city requires investment. Walls are raised because people expect to return, because goods need protection, because water must be defended, because authority needs visible boundaries. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the built remains point toward a settlement that had learned to hold its place against the open landscape. It was not floating randomly in the sand. It belonged to a system. The second answer is water. Every desert ruin must be read through thirst. A room may be domestic, a wall may be defensive, a courtyard may be commercial. But the deepest question always returns to how people drank, washed, cooked, watered animals, and endured long dry stretches. Where water installations survive, they carry the weight of the whole settlement. A well shaft, a cistern, a plastered basin, or a channel may look plain beside more dramatic ruins. Yet these features explain the city's existence more clearly than any ornament could. Without water management, trade would pass elsewhere or not pass at all. With it, even a harsh place could become dependable enough to attract caravans. But dependability is not the same as abundance. What survives in the record suggests a city operating within limits, not a lush paradise hidden under sand. This is important because later imagination often turns lost desert cities into impossible gardens or glittering capitals. Archaeology tends to show something more disciplined: rooms built to function, spaces reused, repairs made when materials allowed, and a constant awareness of scarcity. The city's strength was not that it escaped the desert, it was that it understood the desert well enough to survive inside its narrow permissions. That kind of knowledge leaves traces not in grand decoration, but in layout, storage, drainage, and wear. Pottery gives another layer. Broken ceramics are among the most common finds at ancient sites, and they may appear humble, but they are powerful evidence because they tie people to habits. Cooking pots suggest food preparation. Storage jars suggest planning and supply. Fine wares, if present, may hint at status or exchange. Transport vessels can connect the settlement to routes beyond itself. The clay fabric, shape, firing. And style can sometimes help date occupation or identify cultural contacts. A single sherd cannot carry too much meaning alone, but hundreds of fragments can begin to outline patterns of life. They show that people ate here, stored here, traded here, and broke things here in the ordinary way living people do. Imported or non-local materials, when found, matter especially. A desert settlement tied to trade should show some evidence of connection, though absence of certain objects does not necessarily disprove exchange. Valuable goods may have moved through without being discarded. Organic materials may decay. Incense itself, unless preserved under special conditions, may leave only faint traces or none at all. This is a surprising detail. A city built around a famous trade may not preserve much of the famous product. The containers, routes, installations, and economic position may tell the story more clearly than the cargo. Archaeology often studies wealth by following the waste and infrastructure around it, because the wealth itself was carried away. Animal remains can also speak quietly. Camels, goats, sheep, cattle in some regions, and other animals leave bones, dung traces, and sometimes pathware or enclosure patterns. In a caravan city, animals are not background scenery. They are engines of movement. A camel is not merely an animal standing at the gate. It is a transport system with legs, appetite, endurance, illness, and limits. Feeding and watering caravan animals would have shaped the settlement's space and economy. The number of animals present at peak moments may have transformed the city temporarily, filling courtyards and approaches with noise, smell, and urgency. If bones or related evidence survive, they help reveal the practical cost of long-distance trade. The ruins may also show defense, though defense should not be interpreted too narrowly. Walls can protect against raiders, but they can also manage access, assert control, and create confidence for merchants. A trader carrying valuable goods wants not only water but predictability. He wants to know that his cargo can be stored, that disputes will be handled, that animals can rest without being stolen, that the gate has rules. Defensive architecture in a trade settlement can be economic infrastructure. It reassures movement. It tells strangers that someone here has authority, and that authority can be useful. Yet many claims must remain cautious. Scholars still debate how to connect specific ruins with famous names, how large the settlement truly was at different periods, how long it remained occupied, and what exact combination of trade, water, politics, and environment shaped its decline. Archaeology offers anchors, not omniscience. A radiocarbon date may place an organic sample within a range, but it does not explain the whole city. A wall style may suggest a period, but walls can be repaired and reused. A trade object may prove contact, but not the scale of commerce. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence, because ancient cities are not single-cause machines. They are webs of habits, resources, pressures, and choices. What the ruins do show, with growing force, is that the desert was never passive emptiness. People organized it. They moved across it with skill. They selected hard places for reasons that made sense in their own world. The buried city reveals a landscape of intelligence, not the abstract intelligence of puzzles, but the practical intelligence of water, walls, timing, animals, and trust. Its builders understood that a dangerous route could become a source of wealth if enough people believed the risk was manageable. They built a place where risk could pause. The exposed remains also restore scale to the story. A lost city is not important only if it is enormous. A settlement of modest size can sit at the hinge of a vast network. A few wells, a few walls, and a cluster of storage rooms may influence the movement of goods across hundreds of miles. The ancient world was held together by such places, stations, ports, passes, oases, forts, markets, and river crossings that rarely dominate popular imagination but quietly make long-distance civilization possible. The desert city beneath the sand belongs to that hidden architecture of connection. In the end, the ruins do not solve every legend attached to them. They do something better. They bring the story back to Earth. Beneath the tales of vanished splendor lies a real place where people made careful decisions under harsh conditions. Beneath the romance of a city swallowed by sand lies the slower truth of maintenance, trade, strain, and abandonment. The stones do not shout. They correct. They say that the mystery was never only whether the city existed. The deeper mystery is how many worlds like this once held the ancient roots together, then vanished so quietly that only fragments remained to prove how necessary they had been. The hardest question is not whether the desert hides a city. By this point, the stones have already answered that. Walls, rooms, water systems, pottery, and traces of movement make denial less interesting than interpretation. The harder question is whether this particular buried place is the city remembered by later tradition, the name carried through stories, texts, maps, and speculation, until it became almost larger than geography. That question is more dangerous, because it tempts the mind towards certainty before the evidence is ready. A ruin can be real, a legend can be old, but proving that the ruin and the legend belong to one another is a different kind of work. A famous name has gravity. Once it is attached to a site, every stone seems to lean toward it. Visitors arrive expecting confirmation. Writers shape the evidence into a cleaner story. Popular imagination smooths away the awkward details, because uncertainty is less satisfying than discovery. Yet archaeology lives inside awkward details. It asks whether the location fits the routes described or implied by ancient sources. It asks whether the dates of occupation match the period in which the city should have flourished. It asks whether the material culture belongs to the right world, whether inscriptions support the identification, whether trade evidence is strong enough, whether water sources could sustain the scale imagined, and whether alternative sites may fit just as well or better. Scholars still debate such questions because the evidence remains incomplete, and because ancient memory rarely behaves like a modern address. The problem begins with names. A name preserved in tradition may refer to a city, but it may also refer to a region, a people, a confederation, a route, a well, or a cluster of settlements. Over centuries, the borders between these meanings can blur. A trading centre may lend its name to the surrounding district. A tribe may be remembered as if it were a place. A ruined place may inherit an older name because later travellers need a way to explain what they see when texts are copied, translated, summarized, or interpreted in new religious and political settings. The name may survive while the geography becomes unstable. The result is a kind of historical echo recognizable, compelling, but difficult to locate precisely. This is especially true in desert environments, where places are often known through movement rather than fixed settlement alone. A route can be more important than a point. A caravan master may remember a sequence of wells, ridges, and stopping places, not a coordinate. A poet may name a place for its emotional weight rather than its administrative boundary. A later scholar may inherit that name without ever crossing the land. What survives in the record suggests that ancient desert geography was practical, relational, and sometimes seasonal. Modern attempts to pin it down can be useful, but they can also impose a precision the original sources never intended. The buried city's supporters point to the logic of its landscape. It lies in a setting where water, trade, and movement could plausibly meet. It shows built remains that fit a settlement of importance in a hard environment. It appears connected to routes that would have mattered in the movement of goods, perhaps including aromatics and other valuable materials. Its ruins are substantial enough to suggest more than a temporary camp, yet vulnerable enough to explain why later travellers might lose sight of it. The surrounding desert, with its shifting sands and difficult access, gives the disappearance a believable mechanism. These are not trivial points. They make the identification attractive because they connect legend to a real human system. But caution remains necessary. A place can fit the general pattern without being the famous city. The ancient world contained many desert stations, caravan stops, fortified wells, and settlements tied to trade. Some flourished briefly, some moved location over time, some were known locally and never entered grand written tradition. Others may have been remembered under names now lost. If researchers begin with the assumption that the most famous legend must correspond to the most impressive ruin, they may overlook a more complicated reality. No single explanation fully accounts for all the possible links between the site, the stories, and the wider trade network. The city may be the remembered one. It may be one part of a broader remembered landscape. It may be a real place later absorbed into a legend that originally referred to something larger or different. Dating is one of the strongest tests, and also one of the most frustrating. Pottery styles, radiocarbon samples, inscriptions if present, architectural comparisons, and stratigraphy can all help build a timeline. But timelines often emerge in ranges, not crisp dates. A site may have multiple phases: an early occupation, a period of growth, a later reuse, a final abandonment, and occasional visits afterward. A legendary city may also contain memories from more than one period. Later storytellers may compress centuries into a single dramatic past. If the archaeology points to occupation across several phases, which phase corresponds to the tradition? If the tradition preserves a collapse, does it describe the final abandonment, an earlier disaster, or a moralized memory of decline? These questions do not weaken the archaeology. They reveal how difficult it is to join earth and story without forcing either one. There is also the question of scale. Legends often enlarge. A trading settlement that seemed impressive to travellers in a hostile landscape could become, in retelling, a city of extraordinary splendour. In a desert, even modest abundance can feel miraculous. A reliable well, strong walls, stored goods, and the scent of costly resin may produce an impression far greater than the settlement's actual size. Later imagination may transform that impression into towers, palaces, and impossible wealth. The surprising detail is that the exaggeration may preserve a real perception, not that the city was impossibly grand, but that it felt astonishing because of where it stood. Archaeology therefore has to ask a subtler question. Not simply, does the site match the legend exactly, but what kind of historical experience could have generated the legend a city controlling water and trade in a lethal environment could easily become memorable? Its decline could become moralized, its burial could become supernatural, its name could travel after its walls disappeared. The ruin may not match every detail later attached to it, but it may still explain why the story endured. That possibility sits between skepticism and belief, and it may be closer to the truth than either extreme. The identity problem remains unresolved not because nothing is known, but because enough is known to make the question serious and not enough is known to close it. The stones confirm human ambition in the desert, the roots suggest connection, the water systems explain survival, the legends preserve memory of a place made powerful and then lost. But the final bridge between name and ruin is still built from partial evidence. The city beneath the desert stands in that narrow space where archaeology is most fascinating, no longer myth, not yet fully settled history. It forces us to accept that some discoveries do not end a mystery. They refine it. They take a story out of fantasy and place it under the harder, stranger light of evidence, where every answer has edges and every uncertainty matters. Once the legendary mist thins, the city becomes more remarkable, not less. It no longer has to be imagined as a place of impossible towers or buried treasure. It can be understood as something more human and more fragile, a working city of trade, water, animals, labour, and trust. Its power did not come from magic hidden in the dunes. It came from the ability to make dangerous movement predictable. In the ancient world, that was no small achievement. A desert route was never just a line between two markets. It was a chain of risks, and every link had to hold. The merchants who passed through such a place did not move through romance. They moved through calculation. Every load had weight, every animal had limits, every day on the road consumed water, food, strength, and patience. A caravan could look impressive from a distance, a long dark thread crossing pale ground, but inside that movement was constant vulnerability. A sick camel could slow the group, a broken strap could spill goods into the dust, a wrong turn could waste water that could not be replaced, a rumour of raiders could change the route entirely, a dry well could become a crisis before the sun reached its height. The city mattered, because it reduced uncertainty in a world where uncertainty killed. This practical role is easy to miss because long-distance trade is often described through the luxury goods at its end: incense rising in temples, spices on elite tables, fine cloth in palaces, metals shaped into ornaments or tools. But the system itself depended on less glamorous work. Someone had to breed and manage animals. Someone had to know where grazing might be found after rain. Someone had to dig wells, guard them, repair them, and remember their condition. Someone had to produce the food that travellers carried. Someone had to make rope, leather bags, saddles, jars, baskets, and shelters. Someone had to keep accounts, settle disputes, enforce agreements, and decide what happened when too many people arrived at once needing the same scarce water. What survives in the record suggests that desert trade was a vast human arrangement disguised as a movement of goods. The buried city sits within that arrangement as a point of concentration. It gathers needs that are usually spread across the route. Animals kneel near its approaches, their loads loosened and inspected. Water skins are filled. Goods are moved into storage, sometimes for a night, sometimes longer. Local people exchange food, repairs, information, and protection for profit or obligation. Travellers bring news from other settlements, and that news may be as valuable as any object. A report of conflict ahead, a failed well, a new tax, a storm-damaged track, or a safer passage can determine whether a caravan continues, waits, or turns aside. In that sense, the city is not merely a marketplace, it is an information station. A lesser-known but important detail is that trust itself is infrastructure. Roads are not maintained only by stones and tracks. They are maintained by expectation. Merchants must believe that agreements will be honoured, that weights will not be openly fraudulent, that guides know what they claim to know, that protection can be purchased or negotiated, and that violence will not erupt without consequence. In a fertile city, a breakdown of trust can damage commerce. In a desert city, it can end it. If the city gains a reputation for danger, extortion, or unreliable water, caravans may avoid it even if the distance becomes longer. Reputation travels faster than goods, and it can build or ruin a place. This gives the city's leadership a difficult role. Whoever held authority there had to balance extraction with welcome, charge too little, and the settlement may not maintain wells, guards, storage, and order, charge too much, and merchants may leave, favour one group too openly, and rival groups may attack or abandon the route, fail to mediate disputes, and violence may poison future trade. Scholars still debate the exact political structures of many desert settlements, because authority may have been shared among local elites, kin groups, merchants, religious figures, or officials connected to larger powers. But the need for authority is visible in the logic of the place. Trade does not simply happen in hard landscapes. It must be made to happen. The city's ordinary residents lived at the centre of this tension. Their lives were tied to flows they did not fully control. A household might prosper when caravans were frequent, then struggle when routes shifted. A craftsperson might depend on strangers for customers. A family might store goods for merchants whose languages or customs differed from their own. Local food supplies might be stretched when large groups arrived unexpectedly. Water, the basis of hospitality and profit, could also become a source of resentment. No single explanation fully accounts for the emotional life of such a place, because the record rarely preserves it directly. But the material evidence allows an inference life here demanded flexibility, discipline, and a constant awareness of the horizon. There must also have been moments of abundance, or at least the feeling of abundance. After a caravan arrived, the settlement may have changed almost overnight. Quiet lanes filled with animals and men. Goods from distant regions appeared in courtyards. New smells moved through the air: resin, sweat, foreign oils, dried fish perhaps from coastal zones, leather, smoke, and grain dust. Children watched strangers unload. Local traders calculated quickly. Guards became more alert. The city's importance would be visible in these bursts of intensity, when the wider world briefly entered the walls and the desert outside seemed less like isolation than a road leading everywhere. But these moments depended on countless invisible costs. Camels needed care after hard travel. Injured animals might be sold, slaughtered, or left behind. Water drawn for caravans could lower reserves. Waste accumulated. Conflicts had to be contained before they spread. Travellers might bring illness, unfamiliar customs, or political news that stirred fear. The same movement that enriched the city also stressed it. A trade city in the desert lived by opening itself to strangers, while knowing that every stranger carried risk. This is why the fantasy version of the city is ultimately too simple. It imagines splendor as a stable condition. The real city's wealth, if wealth is the right word, was dynamic and nervous. It passed through in bales, sacks, jars, and memories. Much of it did not stay. Incense moved on. Merchants moved on. Animals moved on. What remained was the profit taken from passage, the objects lost or traded along the way, the buildings maintained to attract the next caravan, and the social order required to keep the system credible. The city was powerful not because it possessed everything, but because everything had to pause there. In this light, its eventual disappearance becomes easier to understand. A place built on movement can be wounded by stillness. If the caravans thin out, the city loses not only income but purpose. If trust breaks, water weakens, politics shift, or maritime routes gain advantage, the settlement's hard-won position can unravel. The desert does not need to defeat a rich fantasy city. It only needs to wait until the real systems of trade and maintenance stop renewing themselves. What the ruins reveal, then, is not a miracle under sand, but a human machine that once worked. It transformed scarcity into leverage. It turned water into authority, danger into profit, and distance into connection. Its people were not mythical desert kings standing above ordinary life. They were builders, guards, merchants, herders, water managers, cooks, potters, guides, children, elders, and labourers who made a harsh place function for as long as the wider world needed it. That is the real astonishment beneath the dunes, not that a city was lost, but that it was ever possible, and that for a time, against heat, thirst, distance, and uncertainty, it held. The desert preserves by refusing to hurry, and erases by never stopping. That contradiction is at the heart of every buried city. Sand can seal a room so gently that a broken jar remains where it fell, protected from ploughs, later building, and the endless rearrangements of crowded human settlement. The same sand can also grind inscriptions until they lose their edges, scatter pottery across slopes, choke wells, and blur the difference between architecture and geology. A desert ruin survives inside a bargain that no one negotiated. It is hidden from destruction because it is hidden from use, but it is also hidden from understanding because the very forces that protect it remove the context that would explain it. In greener lands, abandoned cities are often consumed by people before they are consumed by nature. Stones are carried away for new houses, fields cut through old walls, roots break floors, rain washes occupation layers downhill. Later towns rise on top of earlier towns until the past becomes a compressed mound of many lives. Deserts can interrupt that cycle. If a route fades and a settlement is left too far from easy water or modern expansion, it may escape the worst forms of reuse. No farmer levels its walls for planting. No growing city buries it under streets of concrete. No forest grows thick over its courtyards. Silence becomes protection. But protection is uneven. The desert does not place a glass cover over the past. Wind moves through openings, around corners, and over collapsed roofs. Grains of sand strike exposed surfaces again and again, polishing, abrading, and weakening them. Salt can rise through stone and plaster, crystallizing as moisture evaporates, forcing surfaces to flake apart. Sudden rain can cut channels through deposits that seemed stable for centuries. Heat expands materials, cold nights contract them. The city is not frozen, it is being edited. Some lines grow clearer as sand reveals them, others vanish forever under erosion. The evidence remains incomplete partly because time has not merely hidden the site, time has revised it. This makes desert archaeology both thrilling and frustrating. A sealed deposit can preserve an ancient floor with remarkable clarity, while a nearby wall may have collapsed, been scoured, and redeposited so thoroughly that its original form is almost impossible to reconstruct. One room may hold objects close to where people left them. Another may contain materials blown in from elsewhere. A surface scatter may include pottery from different periods mixed together by erosion, animals, later visitors, and wind. What survives in the record suggests patterns of life, but those patterns have to be disentangled from centuries of natural disturbance. The desert gives evidence, but rarely gives it in order. One surprising detail is that dryness can preserve organic remains under the right conditions, yet also destroy traces people expect to find. Textiles, leather, seeds, wooden objects, and plant fibers may survive in dry, sealed environments where they would rot quickly elsewhere. At the same time, exposed organic materials can become brittle, fragmented, or entirely lost. Incense resin, food remains, basketry, rope, and animal dung may endure in protected spaces, but vanish from areas exposed to sun, wind, and later disturbance. The result is a patchwork survival. Archaeologists may recover an intimate scrap of daily life from one corner and almost nothing from another equally important area. The desert's memory is selective. Burial itself can create illusions. A deeply buried structure may appear older or more important simply because it survived better. A more central building may be destroyed because it remained exposed longer. A modest storage room sealed early by collapse may preserve more evidence than a public space used and cleared repeatedly. Later searchers, seeing what remains, may mistake preservation for significance. They may build their story around the best preserved features, while the most important vanished elements leave almost no trace. Scholars still debate many reconstructions for this reason. The archaeological record is not the city itself, it is the city after survival has chosen unevenly. Deserts also erase connection. A settlement's meaning often lies beyond its walls in roads, grazing zones, seasonal camps, satellite hamlets, wells, watch posts, quarries, and burial grounds. These wider traces are usually faint. Tracks may be covered, then exposed, then covered again. Small camps may leave only ash, stone circles, or scattered tools. Wells may collapse or be reused under new names. Caravan routes may split into many parallel paths as travellers adjust to dunes, weather, and danger. If only the main ruins are found, the city can seem more isolated than it really was. The landscape that gave it purpose may have dissolved into hints. This is why the view from above matters so much, but even that view has limits. Satellite images can show old lines, mounds, and possible routes, yet they cannot easily restore the social world that made those routes meaningful. A track does not reveal who travelled it, what language they spoke, what agreement protected them, what goods they feared losing, or what songs they used to count distance in the dark. A buried wall does not reveal whether its builders felt confident, desperate, ambitious, or exhausted. Archaeology can narrow possibilities. It can establish dates, materials, functions, and relationships, but no single explanation fully accounts for the vanished inner life of a city. The desert preserves objects better than emotions. Still, absence is not emptiness. The missing pieces shape the story as strongly as the surviving ones. A broken water system points toward dependence. A reduced occupation layer hints at contraction. A lack of luxury goods may suggest that valuable cargo moved through rather than stayed, or simply that such goods were removed, decayed, or remain undiscovered. A shortage of inscriptions may reflect poor preservation, limited literacy, different writing habits, or the wrong excavation area. Every absence has several possible meanings. The honest story must hold them lightly. In the end, the desert's greatest act is not burial alone, but transformation. It turns a living city into a landscape problem. It turns streets into ridges, rooms into hollows, walls into stone lines, and memory into dispute. It hides enough to create mystery and preserves enough to prevent forgetting. That is why a city beneath the sand can haunt the modern imagination so deeply. It is neither fully lost nor fully recovered. It remains suspended between erasure and survival, reminding us that the past does not come down to us whole. It arrives damaged, filtered, wind-worn, and partial, asking to be read with patience rather than conquered with certainty. The city's legacy begins with an uncomfortable lesson. Disappearance is not the same as insignificance. A place can vanish from ordinary maps, lose its name, shed its population, and sink beneath sand, yet still have shaped the movement of goods, people, and ideas across a wide region while it lived. The buried city was not necessarily the greatest city of its age, nor the richest, nor the most beautiful. It may never have possessed the splendor later imagination gave it. But it stood where standing mattered. It gathered water, risk, labor, and trade into one fragile point, and for a time that was enough to make it part of the ancient world's hidden machinery. Modern eyes often measure importance by monumentality. We look for pyramids, temples, palaces, gates, inscriptions, statues, and objects that announce power in stone. Desert trade cities often speak more quietly. Their greatness may lie in a well that did not fail, a storehouse that made a dangerous route possible, a wall that gave merchants confidence, or a community capable of turning scarcity into order. What survives in the record suggests that such places were essential precisely because they were practical. They did not need to dominate empires to matter, they needed to connect them. This changes the way the desert itself must be understood. It is not only a blank between civilizations, it is a medium through which civilization moved, slowly and at great cost. The ancient city beneath the dunes proves that hard landscapes can be centers in their own right, not merely margins. A settlement on a desert route may depend on distant markets, yet those distant markets also depend on the settlement. Temples far away may burn incense without knowing the name of the town that made its journey possible. Kings may enjoy luxuries without seeing the wells, animals, guides, and guards that carried them through heat. The city's legacy is partly the recovery of those invisible links. Yet archaeology cannot return everything. It can expose walls, map rooms, date layers, analyze pottery, study water systems, and compare routes. It can show that people lived with discipline and intelligence in a place later mistaken for emptiness. But it cannot fully restore the inner world of the inhabitants. It cannot recover every name spoken in the courtyards, every argument at the well, every fear before a caravan departed, every private memory attached to a doorway or roofline. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a failure. It is the condition under which ancient lives usually reach us. This is why the mystery endures even after discovery. The city is no longer purely lost, but it is not fully possessed. The sand has given back enough to prove human presence and purpose, yet kept enough to preserve humility. Scholars still debate the exact identity, scale, chronology, and relationship between the ruins and the legends attached to them. Some popular accounts want a clean ending: the city is found, the legend is solved. the mystery closes. The real ending is more interesting. The ruins do not close the question. They refine it, stripping away unsupported fantasy while leaving a deeper wonder in place. That deeper wonder is not whether ancient people could build in the desert. They clearly could. It is how many other places like this once existed in the spaces modern memory has flattened into emptiness. For every city found beneath dunes, there may be smaller stations, temporary camps, wells, trackways, and forgotten settlements that remain unnamed. Some may never be discovered. Some may have left traces too faint to survive. Some may be known only through local memory, a mound, a pottery scatter, or a place name whose meaning has shifted. No single explanation fully accounts for how ancient landscapes disappear from history, because disappearance happens in many ways through abandonment, burial, renaming, neglect, conquest, climate, and the simple fact that later generations stop asking the right questions. The buried city also warns against arrogance in the present. Civilizations often imagine their own routes, markets, and systems as permanent because they feel necessary while they function. The desert city must have felt necessary too. Caravans came, water was drawn, goods were stored, rules were enforced. Children grew up inside walls that seemed part of the natural order of things. Then the routes shifted, the systems weakened, and necessity moved elsewhere. What had seemed central became remote. What had seemed durable became ruin. The desert did not need to hate the city. It only needed to outlast the conditions that kept the city alive. Still, the story is not only a warning, it is also a tribute to adaptation. The people who built there understood their world with a precision that deserves respect. They knew that survival was not a heroic gesture, but a repeated practice. They learned where water could be held, how walls should stand, when animals should move, how strangers could be managed, and how profit might be drawn from distance without pretending distance was safe. Their achievement was not invulnerability. It was endurance under pressure. For a while, they made a city where later observers expected only sand. When the ruins return to view, even partially, they widen the human past. They remind us that history is not made only in capitals, battlefields, and fertile river valleys. It is also made at wells, in caravan yards, beside storage rooms, along dangerous tracks, and in settlements that survive because people understand limits. The city beneath the desert becomes a monument not to lost grandeur, but to fragile connection. It shows how ancient worlds were stitched together by places that later vanished from memory almost completely. And so the final image is not of treasure, but of outline. A low wall emerging from sand. A buried room catching light for the first time in centuries. A track visible only from above, running toward a place where people once waited for travelers. The desert still surrounds it, immense and patient. The wind still moves across the surface, lifting and laying down grains as it always has, but the silence is no longer empty. Beneath it lies the evidence of human hands, human risk, and human memory. Not fully recovered, not fully lost, but present enough to change the way the ancient world is imagined. The story slows here, as the desert itself seems to slow at evening. Heat loosens from the stones. Shadows lengthen across the low remains. What looked flat and empty at noon begins to show ridges, hollows, and faint lines of human intention. The city no longer needs to be magnificent in the old legendary sense. It has become something quieter and more lasting proof that people once made a life in a place that offered almost nothing freely, and that even the most unlikely landscapes can hold the marks of care, hunger, ambition, fear, and skill. Perhaps that is why buried cities remain so powerful in the imagination. They remind us that the world we see is only the latest surface. Beneath roads, fields, dunes, forests, and modern towns are older arrangements of hope and necessity. Some were grand, some were modest, some lasted for centuries. Others survived only as long as a route, a spring, a ruler, or a trade demand allowed. Every civilization depends on conditions it does not fully control. and every generation lives closer to disappearance than it likes to believe. The ancient city beneath the desert does not return as a complete answer. It returns as a trace, a wall line, a broken vessel, a dry water system, a memory attached to sand. That may be enough. Not every past life can be recovered in full, and not every mystery should be forced into certainty. Sometimes the most honest ending is to stand at the edge of what is known and let the remaining silence keep its shape. Night settles over the dunes. The last light touches the stone, then withdraws. The wind begins again, soft at first, moving grains over thresholds where feet once passed. Above, the stars appear with the old clarity travellers once trusted. Below, the city rests in fragments, no longer entirely forgotten, never entirely returned, and in that half-hidden state, between memory and erasure, it remains what it has been for centuries, a human mark beneath the desert, waiting in silence while the world moves on,